Hi, so we've now turned a corner in our considerations, in that the program itself is about financial and digital innovations, and you can look at financial innovations and we can look at digital innovations, but remember there's a huge amount of crossover between the two. In the earlier part of the program, I was starting to assert that banks, or should we really be thinking of banks as just traditionally what they are, or should we start to really consider them as being um, tech companies? And I think that there is an argument to suggest that because of the nature of the banking industry, particularly a considerable part of it, there is an argument to suggest that banks can be both financial intermediaries and creators of credit. Now, in the intermediary sense, is that the banks, along with the tech firms, large tech firms, act as platforms, and we'll think about what platforms are in the next video. But before we get there, we really need to start to think about the foundations of what's become known as the new economy. Now, the new economy itself, I think, is probably a little bit misleading because it's been referred to as the new economy since the early 90s, maybe like late 1980s. And that's a bit old hat. It's not new anymore because it's the economy. It's where we are. But nevertheless, it's still referred to as the new economy, as distinct from the old economy. And the old economy might be typified by a reliance upon manufacturing, industrial production, and so on and so forth, where the new economy is something which is considered to be demonstrably different. Now, I think, again, there's an argument here that needs to be considered, is that how different is the new economy really? Okay, and we'll consider that as we go through the rest of the lecture series this semester. But first off is that there's no real sort of like start point or watershed moment about about the development or the generation creation of the new economy. Is that really it's the new economy comes out of a series of observable trends that suggest that there's been a huge shift that's taken place in our society, economy, and the world of work. And in some respects, that's quite similar, isn't it, to financialization, observable trends suggesting that there is a shift. Well, these are occurring all at the same time. And sometimes I think that it's probably a mistake of ours is that we should be considering them in isolation. So my plea to you is not to look at these topics as being discrete topics, is that they are all interrelated. The new economy and financialization, digitalization, globalization go hand in hand. It's the conjuncture, if you will, and if you like. So within this new economy, or this paradigm shift, is that manufacturing has been displaced by information work that deals with information. And that seems to be a systemic break and is therefore indicative of widespread transformation. This movement away from manufacturing work, making things, and into information work, which could be typified by all forms of service work, or not all forms, sorry, that was a bit lazy phrasing, could be typified by many kinds of service work, indicates widespread transformation from one to the other. And we have started to see, or we are seeing, familiar and recurrent themes related to networks replacing hierarchies, flatter organization with collaboration and collegiality replacing the command and control management styles that have typified manufacturing, and that brain power replaces physical power. Now, all of those assertions are made with best intentions, but nevertheless have not networks replaced hierarchies? Has command and control been displaced by collaboration and collegiality? So it's a matter of extent, and we need to look at these things a bit more deeply in order to be able to ascertain what's really going on. The information society, manufacturing to information, represents the dominant way of thinking about the nature and the development of our society. This shift from manufacturing and manufacturing jobs into information, knowledge-related jobs impacts not just the world of work, but the wider society around within which we work as well. So let's look at some of the theoretical foundations for these observable trends, and we start with Daniel Bell's work on the upskilling thesis. And he wrote a book in 1976, which was quite prescient at the time, about the coming of the post-industrial society. So even at that time, back in 1976, which was a long time ago, people were starting to talk about the potentialities of ICTs, digital innovations, changing the world of work and moving things away from where we made wholesale things, manufactured on a mass scale wholesale things, and moved and shifted into an informational type mode of production. Now, I think that one of the things that needs to be brought about here or thought about here is that I don't think Bell is saying that we're going to shift and not make stuff anymore. What he's talking about is really because somebody needs to make the stuff, okay? Because we do need goods and services. We need goods, we need food, we need clothes, we need all those other things that we use in order to be able to make our lives more tolerable. But so really what Bell is talking about is that there's a movement from the industrial, and if you want to go back before that, you can look from the agricultural, so the agricultural to the industrial to the post-industrial, the informational. So it's a developmental stage in our societies. It's stage theory, in other words. And there's a qualitative shift, therefore, in the rise of theoretical knowledge, according to Bell. Okay, so theoretical knowledge, abstract knowledge, is going to be the kind of like the core element of economic production, the axis around which new technology, economic growth, and the stratification will be organized, according to Bell in his book. And at the time that Bell wrote his book, he argued that the US would be leading this shift from industrial and into the informational, followed by the rest of the world. Now, I think there's a big argument to be had there, isn't it, as to whether or not that is the case. And I think that the Japanese and the Koreans, and possibly even the Chinese, might dispute that, in that under Trump, there has been a movement in order to reclaim industrial production rather than accept the transition from the industrial to the informational. So that, I think that's debatable. And again, we'd need to look at it, and we'd need to find the data in order to we create an argument and find the data to see which one is the most convincing. So let's just finish off, continue to develop Bell's thinking. Bell suggests that advances in society require a better educated workforce to deal with the increasing complexity of work tasks. And as a consequence of that is that you get a shift in educational systems in advanced economies away from preparing people for a career of work which is labour intensive, and starting to move towards preparing people for work which is more brain intensive. And he also sees quite a considerable expansion in the service-based sector, epitomised, if you like, by a white-collar society dominated by service work and the centrality of theoretical knowledge. Movement away from industrial production to service work. So the idea about white collar being as if you've got a shirt and tie on and you don't sweat, so you can wear white collars because it's not going to get all grimy and so on and so forth. So you move from the industrial to the white collar service work, which is going to be focused upon theoretical knowledge. Okay. Now, theoretical, I think probably needs qualifying. I don't think he's really talking about knowledge in the theoretical as we're dealing with theories and theoretical work, but he's certainly talking about knowledge working and information which is in the abstract, i.e. it needs sorting, it needs interpreting, it needs some meaning being added onto it rather than it being the meaning of the data or the work that we're doing, it being completely explicit. Okay, so there is some work that needs to be done in processing all of the data. The central person within this service sector is going to be a professional. equipped with high levels of education and training in order to be able to utilise their new skills and provide the new skills that industry is going to require. And as I said, there's a shift in education, a substantive shift, or a substantive shift as well, in not only the practice of education, but also focus on education. And there's just some general quotes here from various supposed luminaries and people who know what they're talking about in theory, about how important labour education is going to be. In today's knowledge-based economy, according to Bill Clinton, what you earn depends in what you learn. Jobs in the information technology sector pay 85% more than the private sector average. Peter Drucker, who's a management consultant and writer, basic economic resource, the means of production is no longer capital, nor natural resources, nor labour, it is and will be knowledge. Kofi Annan, knowledge is power, information is liberating, education is the premise of progress in every society, in every family. And Tony Blair, the UK Prime Minister from 1992 through to, 96 perhaps, through to 2010. A part of his manifesto was about the focus upon education, education, education. And it was Blair that stipulated the goal or the educational outcome that 50% of young people within the United Kingdom would experience or would enjoy university education. Just as they decided to actually introduce the individual fees for the self-same education, is that prior to that is that university education in the United Kingdom was free to all of its citizens. I myself, when I went to university, didn't pay a penny towards it. I had to pay for my master's degree and I had to pay for my final degree, my third degree, but nevertheless is that even though there's a shift away towards education, 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 there's also a shift towards individuals paying for that education. Now there's an issue there, isn't there, related to, well, can 50% of the UK's population afford to pay for their education? And then the finance kicks in behind it and provides the money, the cash, at a fee to enable young people like you to do your education. That's a strange anomaly for me, that is that if education is to be the bedrock of our economic performance, perhaps the government really ought to put its hand in its pocket and facilitate it. So let's think about Bell's informational economy thesis. And I think it's fair to say that there's an idealisation of service work. There's service work and there's service work. There's working in a call centre, that's service work. There is working in data centres, which is importing data, which is also very labour intensive, not overly interesting, I would argue, which is different from the actual processing, the thinking about the data in and of itself. So with this sort of like over-idealisation about what service work might encompass, is that you created a sort of like a mythical kind of new intelligentsia, a mass intelligentsia based upon education. So Bell's misjudged the significance and the expansion of professional work, is that quite a lot of service work in the 21st century is not quite as glorious as perhaps Bell had envisaged it was going to be. It's glamorised the professionals and the rise of the person information orientated society. So it's a bit naive, really, that there's going to be a shift from the, in his work he calls it the economizing, that's hard to say, ethos towards a sociologizing mode of life, one which is less about every man for himself, homo economicus, into we're all in it together, sociological, communitarian, I think is probably a nicer word, one which focuses on the sense of community. And his argument is very deterministic. His thesis is based around the theories of technological determinism. You remember that back in week 1? Okay. Assumes technology is the decisive agent in social change. Technology drives the change and produces outcomes. and it assumes that technology is aloof, sits outside of the social world, even though the impact of technology in this post-industrial area that he's talking about has phenomenal and enormous impacts. Is that if you look, this is global, by the way, is that if you look at the percentage of global GDP, 70% of the world's economy is based on services, selling services to the likes of you and I. Industry accounts for 27% of it, and agriculture 3.1% of it. Over time, agriculture has diminished. Now, manufacturing is diminished, and the service sector is starting to expand. Now, you could look at that and say, well, is the service sector expanding because of the fact that it's doing something new and it's creating something new and discernibly different and demanded? Or is the service sector expanding because of the fact that there are lots of people that are underemployed, seeking employment opportunities as agriculture and manufacturing becomes more proficient at supplying the same level of goods? If we are becoming more proficient and that we're supplying X amount of goods, but we need less labour to do with it, what do you do with the labour? Hence, therefore, education, and then move them into information work based in the service sector. But there are questions about the quality of the work that is existing that is available within the service sector. And of course, you can look at figures in the aggregate, but really, when you break them down, they look slightly different. If you look at the UK's economy, is that London, which is our chief economic central node, 91% of labour is based on the service sector. And then that goes down so that the right at the bottom there is the East Midlands, which surprises me because that's my home area. It's got the lowest amount of service work that's in it. But there's differences across economies, and that also raises questions, therefore, is that on sectors or areas of the map that are still very industrial, but industry we know is reducing, is that what happens, what replaces that kind of work? What kind of service work replaces it? Okay, I think it's an interesting sort of challenge and conundrum for policymakers. And then moving away from Daniel Bell's work and into the work of Manuel Castells. Now, you probably won't have heard of Manuel Castells. You might have done, actually, but he is significant. He's a significant player. He's a significant social scientist in this particular area, and he produced an extraordinary piece of work originally in 1996 called The Information Age. And again, like Bell, although no, that's not fair, is that whilst Bell was making predictions based upon what he saw, is that Castells empirically observed what was going on around him and made some prescient statements about the way that he saw the future. So the book itself, the Information Age, is in 3 volumes, and it's huge. I'm not advocating that you should perhaps read it, but I have made them available I've made the first volume to you, and I'm suggesting that you should read the introduction and the chapter 1 of the first volume of The Information Age, and also a subsequent publication that he made in 2009 called Communication Power. Now, are they important to read them? I think they are important to read them. Are they essential reading? No, I don't think so. But nevertheless, it will give you a good grounding and background in terms of like the thoughts and the movements about what people were, or how people were starting to think about the way that work and society was going to operate. So his core argument, therefore, is that the Information Age builds on Bell's work, if you like. The Information Age introduces a new society which is brought into being by the development of ICT, computerization-enabled networks, which prioritizes information flows, the flow of information and data. The fundamental source of productivity power is of flat hierarchies. Self-programmable labour leads to the accumulation of knowledge. And in that respect, not too distinct from Bell's thesis. The difference here is that it's self-organizing, self-emergent. There's no need for the requirements of the hierarchies anymore. It's self-programmable labour. It uses the expression programmable in order to, I guess, sort of give it more of a feel of the new and the technological. But actually, when he's talking about self-motivated rather than programmable. Okay, which leads to the accumulation of knowledge individually, but that knowledge is shared through networks and through information flows, so that the aggregate level of information and knowledge, human knowledge, expands. And because it's expanding in a network, I think also Castells would argue that that information and data is changing exponentially. Castells is one of the first individuals to start talking about networks linking people, institutions and countries. We're not linked in linear relationships, but in multilinear networks. And I don't think there's anything new in that. Is people have always been linked in networks, but the difference here is that it's the facilitation and the growth of those networks through computer technologies that Castells is focusing on. And the unifying theme about all of his work is about this idea about global integration. So globally integrated through the network, but individuals within the network are becoming more and more fragmented away from it. Okay, information flows is everything. The people within it, the nodes within the network, are of less importance. Okay, so individuals, humans, are displaced away from this communitarian aspect and are able to exist on their own within their own networks and within their own ICT enabled realities. And this, I think, is the real core of Castells' argument. I think it's a lovely phraseology that's here. He says that the space of places is replaced with the space of flows. Flows of data and information between people organized in networks, as opposed to located and people were co-locating, people working, people exist in families as well, existing in same places, same geographies as they had done for, well, quite a considerable period, hundreds of years before that, has been displaced by these ICT enabled networks, and it's been replaced. This space of place is replaced with the space of flows. It's all about the flow of data, flow of information. Points to a meritocracy is that the people that will thrive in this will be competent networkers, be able to utilize their networks, but they'll also be the better educated, the better trained. So the network society is a society of a meritocracy. The better people, the better networks thrive, and as a consequence, those that are in those networks benefit as a consequence of it. And he also talks about the transformation of corporations into networks. I've mentioned the book there, Communication Power, which is also in the reading list online. And the reason that Castells, really, to my mind, it's the fourth volume of the Information Age. And the reason that Castells suggests that it needs to be there is because he hadn't adequately organise his thoughts to be able to deal with power within a network economy. Well, he does that in the fourth volume in order to suggest that relationships between people are asymmetric. Some people have got more power than others, and it's the network that facilitates the power. But also the producers and and I think that we could talk about this more latterly, the platforms within the production of information are gatekeepers and holders of power, in that they have the capacities in order to be able to almost propagandize what people see and hear. Now, that is a later development, but it comes out of an earlier work by Noam Chomsky and his co-writer, which I think was written in the 1980s, which is called Manufacturing Consent, which I've talked about before. You don't need to worry about that now, because we'll come back and we'll talk about manufacturing consent on another day. So that's part one. I'll be back later on once you've had a chance to digest all of that, and we'll deal with part two. Now, what I would suggest that you do is that you do spend some time, go back over the video, make yourself some notes so that you've got your own understanding about what it is that we've been talking about, and write your notes, but also think about what you've learned as a consequence of this short video. Okay, see you later.